This is the Fire Dog Podcast.
The views and opinions presented on today's episode are those of the speaker and do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Defense or the United States Air Force.
Welcome, my name is Matt Wilson. I'm joined with Chris Boykley. Thank you for joining us for episode 56 of the Fire Dog Podcast. In this episode, we sit down with Austin Perry, a Staff Sergeant in the United States Air Force and a company officer at Eielson Air Force Base, Alaska. Austin has invested a lot into learning about F-3, or Fluorine Free Foam, and has first-hand, real-world experience applying foam during aircraft mishaps while stationed at Eielson. Austin responded to an F-35 crash in January 2025 and an F-16 mishap in the summer of 2025. On both occasions, F-3 was applied, giving him invaluable first-hand knowledge of its effectiveness. He's also attended Dallas-Fort Worth's Fire Training Research Center F-3 foam course, where he received formal training on the science and application techniques of F-3. To learn more about F-3 and to watch training videos provided by Austin, head over to our website, firedog.us, find episode 56. There you will find links to training resources and videos highlighting F-3's performance and application techniques. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the podcast, Austin Perry. Austin, welcome back.
What's up, brother?
It's good to have you.
Yeah.
Three-time guest, returning guest.
Hell yeah.
So before we get into the episode, remind the listeners who you are, where you've been, and any other details that you'd like to share.
Cool. Staff Sergeant Austin Perry. Been in the Air Force for coming up almost 10 years. Be 10 years early next year. Started out at Shaw and currently here in Eielson. And then 2 deployments, Africa and Qatar. So other than that, that's everywhere I've been.
That's it, man? 30 seconds, that's all you got?
Yeah, man,
He's a young guy.
I'm not special.
You're definitely special.
A little bit.
So F-3 firefighting foam, man, so a staff sergeant at Eielson, why are you the guy talking to us about F-3 foam?
Well, I would call myself lucky, I suppose. Lucky that my organization sent me down to Dallas and got some really, really eye-opening training. And then before that I even got that training, actually got to use it in real life on the F-35 crash back in January. Was part of the first rescue company on that call. Due to the cold and stuff, crash trucks had some complications with stretching the line and stuff, which allowed me to kind of sneak over there and end up grabbing the nozzle and getting after it whenever we got everything set up. So being able to just have that first use or first-hand experience on the line. And so with that kind of led me whenever I went, so I did it in real life, and then I actually went to the training. And then once I went to the training and it being so eye-opening and kind of seeing some of the stuff that the foam can do, because that's been the narrative, right, the whole time is like, yeah, we know F-3's not as effective, and we know that it's, not as good, but why is it not as good? And so having a little bit deeper understanding kind of allowed me to start really digging into some of this stuff, and then trying to connect some of the dots, basically.
What kind of stuff were you doing in Dallas at that training?
So Dallas, Dallas-Fort Worth Fire Department, they host the F-3 class. They actually have a very phenomenal training center. They do all kinds of classes. I actually think they have like an advanced AFFF course. We're sending some guys down there just to check it out and see if it has any value or not. But the F-3 course, they are kind of like leading the way, or have been leading the way with the transition, because the FFA is also, switched to, most people are switching to F-3 because, cancer and the environment and stuff. But mainly it's just to kind of go over what they found as best practice, see some of the equipment that they've kind of tested and found to be the best, and then just being able to use it and see what it's like, and on the hard packed surface, see how it reacts, see how it aerates and expands, and then they, light a fuel fire for you, and then you can kind of see some of these things, or they can kind of try and recreate, depending on how windy it is. There, it was windy, super windy the day that I went. Also, see how the reach and the weather, how that kind of impacts the throw of the foam. But mainly, they can kind of recreate some of, if you want to call them hostile or safety concerns, so you can see in real time what they look like. So it's a pretty invaluable experience.
Yeah, so you have the 35 crash. You have a 16 mishap, which we didn't mention.
Mm-hmm.
Right, you were on that, right?
I responded. I got recalled for it, so I got there in time. They were still out there, more in the overhaul stage, but got to pick those guys' brain. But when they were cutting up the first 35, the recovery team or whatever was using saws on it, or I don't know what they do, but anyway, essentially they recaught the 35 completely on fire, if not bigger the second time than the first time, because it had time. There was some dispatching problems, and I think they ended up calling Fairbanks 911 because they couldn't get a hold of our 911. So I had 10 minutes to sit there and burn. So it was cooking. So I got to be the first to crash. I was actually the first company officer on that call as well. So then we redid the whole thing over again, basically.
Yeah, I remember that, man. It was at the end of the day, and I mean, I'm on Eielson. I was on Eielson at the time, and I could see it from my house.
Yeah. Well, we heard panic on because I guess they were using our radios or whatever, and I just heard some dude panic on the radio, and it wasn't normal fire department talk. It was just somewhat really muffled screaming, basically, because they had basically it was they had been having little small spot fires when they would cut it up, and then you think about cutting a fuel soaked jet, it just went. And so anyway, we're that was weird, and we're all sitting in the kitchen, and then they dispatch it out a few minutes later, and I open up the stall doors, and there's just this giant smoke plume. I'm like, oh, it's on fire, not a little tiny fire. So it was instantaneous go mode.
Yeah. So yeah, anyways, 35, and then 35 rekindle, which is a couple months later. 16, which you weren't directly a part of, but you were there and within the organization that had to experience it. So, and then you had the Dallas class that you just mentioned, and you also did you dig into anything else?
Yeah. So sorry, not to cut you off. When the 16 happened, they sent a bunch of the big dogs down to interview that whole shift. And then Chief wanted me to basically brief, because the other two incidents had happened on B shift, so I kind of was the B shift representative, kind of brief some of the chiefs on that. And I had already started I was once I went to Dallas, it was really eye-opening, because I was I completely did. Granted, I got away, and the incident was a situation that I didn't put myself in a bad spot, but if that had been on the runway, or say the pilot was closer or whatever, I would have done everything probably wrong, and could have potentially put myself in harm's way just because I didn't know. And so once I got that information, I was I need to put this together in a package for everybody that hasn't gone to this class, so they can have the information. And so then Chief Winkleman, he brought up that, we have a CBT for this stuff. It was kind of the best course of action that we had at the time. So he kind of asked me, Kay, would you mind combing through and kind of making suggestions? And that's kind of where the presentation came from. I had taken all these videos at Dallas. I had started combing through the Naval Research study. I had started combing through the Air Force CBT. It's the firefighting tactics CBT. And so it wasn't that the information was good, but it'd be one of them had this was good, one of them this was good, and then one of them, like, no one had the complete picture because no one had used it in real life yet. And so it was kind of like taking the goods from all of those and putting them in one central place. And that's basically how that happened.
Yeah, I'm glad you covered all that, man. So for the listeners, what I'm trying to, show is that Austin knows what he's talking about, and he has the experience. Not to say that he's the only one that knows what he's talking about. I'm sure there's others out there that have experience with this stuff that we don't know about and that have invested in training and trying to understand it, or maybe even went to Dallas. Just trying to, show that he does have expert power before we start talking about the intricacies of it, the tactics to employ, and things like that. Because this stuff, and if you take any point away from this episode, is F3 and AFFF are not the same thing. I think everybody understands that, but maybe not to the extent that we should understand that. With AFFF, you can throw it on a fire however you want, and it's going to do what it does, right? It has the filament or the surfactant that is going to take care of those fuel vapors that are, not going to ignite, where the F3 doesn't do that. And so that's why we put this episode together. That's why we brought Austin on.
The fluorinated surfactant, yeah.
So, Austin, when you hit us with, you mentioned after the fact you kind of learned, maybe I should have done this, or there was just kind of a disconnect in your brain having been trained with AFFF, now using F3 for the first time. What were some of those kind of lessons learned?
Eye-opening kind of information.
Yep.
Mainly the resealing properties, and just like without the film, this stuff can do, the vapors and the breakdown of the foam can lead to you getting flanked by the fire. And so, and even with your feet or your hose, and you're trying to make a rescue path, or you're, actively engaging this, and you're entering into the blanket, without knowing, some of these things or seeing some of these things, like, you could potentially put yourself in a bad way because, you're trying to advance into this blanket, and now you thought you had put the fire out to your right, but maybe you had blanket breakdown, or maybe it tunneled under the blanket without that film to suppress the vapors, and now you're getting flanked from your right, and now you got to completely, change what you're doing, or you're, in a fire. So it's just some of that stuff because with AFFF, I'm in my mindset, like, bird goes down, or if a pilot's in there, like, I'm going to try and do everything that I can do to get to that guy. And, I'm just, going into the fray, basically. And not saying that you can't do that with F3, but you got to be a little more intelligent, and be able to, know what's good and what's bad, to make that intuitive or that smart judgment call.
It all really stems back to AFFF. We got bubbles and foam. F3, we just got bubbles, right? It's losing that film that's a game changer when it comes to application extinguishment. Right.
And basically also understanding the difference between, like you said, the bubble makeup as well is different. And so when you can kind of see, because the F3 bubbles are all kind of more uniform, and they're all in like a linear line, and they kind of stack up on top of each other. And so when you see the degradation of a blanket, right, and I have pictures and you can kind of see it or be able to see it in real life, you kind of start to draw the line of like, oh, the reason it's starting to sink down lower and lower, or starting to flatten out, it's because those bubbles are bursting. And so every time they burst due to direct flame impingement, your blanket's not as thick. As to where AFFF, you had like big bubbles, little bubbles, and the bubble structure was completely different, but that film was allowed to protect that and suppress everything.
So we highlighted a lot of the difference between AFFF and F3. And again, I think people understand that they're different, and we're going to talk about why they're different. Talk to us about, you sent us a presentation ahead of this podcast, and you mentioned recognition prime decision making, and some people may be familiar with that. I know Chris is certainly familiar with that. Creating that mental model. Connect the dots for us on why you have that within this presentation you created.
So I could probably do a whole nother podcast on this, and I'm sure you could too, Chris. But it's a very I'm fascinated with how people make decisions. And it being directly applied to what we do on the daily. I think it's something that we should all be students of and practicing, because like when you start digging into the Sources of Power, which is the book of Dr. Gary Klein and the RPD model and all that, like it starts to really connect the dots of like, I'm doing that without really understanding that I'm doing that, and so just having a little bit, I think when you study it and you kind of are able to implement that model, it helps you put your training into a rhythm that's understandable for other people. Because if I just give you, and I see this all the time, and I think, and it's one of my biggest complaints to my airmen, is they will know the what, but they might halfway understand the how, but they don't understand the why. And so it's like your explicit memory or your explicit knowledge is like, it's just overload. So when you have the RPD model and you can kind of put it into those, like you're starting to recognize the conditions and you understand what's happening and you know what to do with it, you're distilling the information down into a reaction. Because if it doesn't distill down to a reaction, I'm just overloading you with information. And then you kind of get this paralysis by analysis. And so, because you're like, is it this way? Is it that way? And so it becomes, I use the recognition prime decision making to make it more conditions driven. And then it's kind of like, if you see this, then this. You have a reaction based upon those conditions.
So what's an example when it comes to, extinguishing a fuel fire with F-35 foam? Like what does recognition prime decision make really look like?
So like say, okay, I am engaging the fire and I start to see that there's a couple ways we could go about this. We'll just I start to have blanket degradation and that foam starts to flatten out, right? If I see that, I know that I need to come over the top of that gently. I can't just spray it directly. I can't do like a horizontal or a roll-on because now I'm just going to blow it. And so with the resealing properties without the film, two blankets or two separate you can come over the top, but like if they're next to each other, they're not going to merge together. And so you get what's called seams. And so like along your leading edge of your blanket, you're going to have, say if you have two blankets butted up together, you're going to have a seam or a line in between them. So say if I have that, blankets start to break down, I need to come over the top of it with like a lob or a rain down to basically patch that up. That way those vapors aren't able to come through and reignite. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you're recognizing what's happening, and then your brain is jumping to the solution to fix the problem.
Right.
Using recognition prime decision making.
I try to put everything in a rhythm of that. If you see this, then this. And I obviously we exist in a job where always and nevers. We can't, that would be foolish to do so. So I'm not going to say like every time you see the blanket flatten down, you have to do this. But it's a good option. It's a good option or plan A. So and then also like Gary Klein kind of goes into like it's one of the later models of like the mental simulation or evaluating our actions or like even you might even stick with plan A, but you have to slightly modify it or tweak it to where it's going to be moldable to that certain situation. So I think that's we do that in our job quite frequently. Of like, we're going to do this tactic, but we're slightly going to change it just differently to make it moldable to this situation.
How do we get to the point where we have a mental Rolodex that is ready to employ foam on a jet fuel fire?
So, that's a tough question. With all of our training, it has to be realistic conditions. And I'm not saying you're going out and setting jet fuel on fire, but we can study game film. You can watch fire videos and go over, what you would do and get that decision-making process. Now, I don't know how many videos on YouTube there are of jets blowing up, but you can use, who John Schmidt is?
I don't.
So he was a major, don't quote me on this, he was an officer in the Marine Corps, and he wrote I think he wrote their Marine Corps doctrine, warfighting. Great parallels to the fire service as well. But he came up with what's called TDGs, tactical decision games, and you're just, you could do whatever, you can draw it, you could, put a presentation together, but you're setting the situations, and then you're giving people the conditions that you want them to see. So take a picture of an F-35 and draw squiggly red lines on it, or draw squiggly red lines in front of it like it's a fuel fire or whatever, and then you kind of take them through this game, if you want to call it, based upon the decisions that they make. Now, first off, as the instructor yourself, you have to understand the concept completely in order to be able to do that. But you put somebody on a timer and you say, hey, this is what you see, what are you doing? It makes that more realistic how it would be on the fire ground, rather than they have all the time in the world. And granted, maybe it's a more junior member and you give that more junior member a little bit more time, but you say maybe it's more of a company officer. Hey, this is what you're showing up to, whether it's a house fire or whatever, and what are you doing based upon this is what you see. And then you can kind of start to identify those deficiencies. Maybe he's not picking up on this, this condition, or maybe his ability to read smoke isn't at where it should be. Hey, man, and then you can kind of go into some of that, education part of that. But that's building that mental Rolodex of kind of connecting the dots with the conditions of the visual conditions and the decisions being made.
Yeah, so to distill it down to the most basic level, it's continuous training.
Right.
Continuous quality, and when you can, realistic training.
Right.
And Gord Graham talks about that, and one of the more famous keynotes that he made, it's shown in the fire officer courses, or at least it used to be in the DoD fire officer courses. He talks about recognition, prime decision making, and he gets into the foundation of why that's important, is because when you are faced with a high risk, low frequency circumstance,
mm-hmm.
where you don't have time to think things through, where you're in the fight or flight psychological mode, or what does Dave Grossman call condition red, or
the amygdala hijack?
What's that? Amygdala hijack.
Yeah.
Amygdala hijack. It's Cooper's code of awareness. Jeff Cooper's code of awareness. I think that he was also a Marine. But
the point is that you don't have time now to let me think about what I'm going to do here.
Right.
What situation you are doing whatever is imprinted on your brain. And how do you imprint that stuff on your brain? You continuously, every day, think through and train through when the conditions are calm, so that you can create that mental Rolodex, so that you instinctively react to the best of your ability. And of course, not everybody has a F-35 burning in their backyard. You can't do it to the greatest extent possible, unfortunately, and even bases don't have jet fuel burners. Most of them don't,
No.
because environmental restrictions.
Right.
But to your point earlier, there's videos on this stuff. There's classes in Dallas. There's computer-based training. For what it's worth, there's probably some good nuggets to be pulled out of that. And for, fortunately, Austin has had the experience, and he's been able to see it real world. He's been to Dallas, where they can burn jet fuel and show how F3 works. So there's videos out there, and I'm going to put those videos, and I'm going to accompany them with this episode on our website, firedog.us. So you can head over there and look at some of the. I'm going to put on some of the tactics, the roll on, and the stitching and things like that. I'm going to get those videos on there. So.
Yeah, very important. Just to wrap this up before we move on, though, it's kind of like back to when we talked about tacit knowledge. We deal with a large amount of tacit knowledge in our job, right? So tacit knowledge is basically knowledge that you gain from experience, and we are faced with what's known as the tacit knowledge transfer problem, and so it's you may know how to do something, you know how to ride a bike, but explaining how to ride a bike to your kid is a difficult task. It's the articulation of the information is what's difficult, and that comes back to our instruction. So if you have the experience, whatever it may be, you have to do your best to be able to put that or distill that information down to somebody that doesn't have a frame of reference that it triggers a reaction. And so that becomes to like the explicit, like knowing what, implicit knowing how, but tacit knowledge is knowing how in action. So that's that ability to have the intuition of like judging things or like based upon the cues and patterns. That's kind of why the RPD model is good. You can kind of go over those cues and patterns. Hey, if you're seeing these things, this is what's likely going to happen based upon, just knowing that those are, precursors to that event. And then tacit knowledge is just like knowing how in action. Oh, perceiving rate of change. That's where I was going with that. Of knowing this is being effective right now, whatever I'm doing, my decision that I made is being effective. I'm getting positive return on investment. I know Chris will like that. Or this isn't working. It's not having a positive effect on the fire ground. I need to pivot to plan A or plan B or modify plan A. Okay.
And I think a brutal reality when it comes to aircraft firefighting in general is that the majority of our mental models and our muscle memory, it's all for structural firefighting. Right, which is we're flowing with the nozzle wide open at the seat of the fire, circle pattern, U pattern, whatever it might be.
Right.
Which is totally wrong when it comes to applying foam, and that hasn't really changed, right? You're supposed to roll on, bank down AFFF, but that film made it way more forgiving, where we could kind of use our structural techniques, and it's still
Spray
putting
and
the
pray.
fire out. Yeah, yep.
Yeah.
But with F3, to lay a blanket down where you're straight streaming the ground in front of the fire, like that feels totally unnatural.
Right.
Because that is not the way we would extinguish a structural fire, which is the way we're all kind of primed to think.
Kind of that sink to your lowest level of training.
Yeah, and so I mean, obviously what Matt said is spot on, where that's what we got to combat when it comes to like our decision making and like consuming every bit of training we possibly can when it comes to watching videos and everything, because in the heat of the moment, it's going to take everything that we've got to hopefully react appropriately, to apply the foam in the most efficient manner, because we've got everything inside of us that's going to have us, use structural firefighting techniques when that's not the most effective way to apply F3 foam.
Yeah, man, it never feels good, too, when you don't have a mental framework for a situation, And then that's when you get that paralysis by analysis, because you're just starving for information to try and like lead you to some sort of decision. And then that's really when that condition black or that panic and all that stuff, because your heart rate's immediately going to spike, because you're like, dang, I have no idea what I'm doing right now. This thing's punching me in the face, and I got to do something about it.
Man, I'm fascinated with the psychology and the physiology.
It's such a deep rabbit hole. I could talk about it for
really
hours.
Is, and that's our line of work.
It is,
and that's why it's just so we're expected to perform at top levels under those conditions. It's crazy to me.
Right.
For any decision-making nerds listening, if you're like Austin and you like to take a deep dive into this stuff, he mentioned Sources of Power by Gary Klein. He's considered the father of recognition prime decision-making. And a great follow-on is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Have you guys read that book?
It's on my to-do list. Mission MCTI. They mentioned that book, and but I haven't gotten it, so I'm gonna read it now after you suggested it.
It's interesting because they're kind of on opposite sides of the fence when it comes to decision making. Where Gary Klein is on one side, where he's focused on the power of intuition and the power of seeing something unfold before you, recognizing the cues and expectancies, and then instantly recognizing what needs to be done. Recognition prime decision making. Where Kahneman is more focused on the errors in that kind of decision making, and there are a ton of biases and just flaws that we can bring into any decision making situation. So it's a really challenging thought exercise to read both books and try to distill everything that applies to our profession.
Come up with your own
Yeah.
course of action. Is he the guy who it's like the system 1 and system 2 thinking, and
That's right.
you kind of have the net and your brain is the like a gravity model, and it's people that are good, or especially in like the tactical space, your ability to, so like system 1 being able like to focus in on like the task level and do whatever you need to do, and then system 2 being like the overall strategic picture. And people that are really good decision making or makers are their ability to swing from one to the other, I think, is like what he kind of gets at. That's what the Mission Critical Teams Institute is referencing that book, but that's kind of what they go over, is the ability to pivot your system between your system 1 and system 2 thinking.
Yeah, you can summarize it with recognition prime decision making is system 1 thinking, where it's instant, spontaneous, on the spot. System 2 is a much more slow and deeper, methodical type of
fact-finding kind of.
Yep.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool.
Man, still fascinated. We could do a whole episode on this stuff.
Yeah, we could.
And we should. But before we do that, you talked about, let me get this right, explicit, implicit,
and tacit.
Explicit being knowing what. Let's talk about the science then of the foams and how they're different. We alluded to it a little bit, and it's not going to take much really to cover this, I don't think. But I want to just cover how scientifically they're different in layman's terms, really. I mean, you can use big words to impress some folks. But then after that, I want to talk about transition into the why it's dangerous, right? Why F3 is maybe more dangerous than AFFF.
Gotcha. So yeah, we did talk about it. Obviously, the AFFF foam makeup is different. The bubbles are different sizes, and it's kind of, I have a picture of it, and it looks a lot more sporadic. But the biggest part being the fluorinated surfactant that would drain down from those bubbles and cause the film, and it would kind of cause the blanket to basically seal back up. Is the biggest thing, but that fluorinated surfactant was what was the worst part for us and the environment, so that kind of had to go away. So then with F3, the bubble structure being more linear and stacked on top of each other, without that, it in order, without that fluorinated surfactant to be able to suppress and smother the fuel, you need a bigger, robust blanket of F3 to be able to suppress those vapors that are coming down from the fuel.
Yeah, Chris said it perfectly. AFFF was more forgiving. And we could get
100%.
away with not really knowing much, to be completely honest, and just kind of throw that stuff out there. Of course, we know the bank down and the roll on and the rain down and all the things,
Right.
but that surfactant was really a lifesaver. I think another important point here is that this is going to take a lot more water,
Yes.
or a lot more agent in general, which points to why there needs to be a manpower increase for this kind of stuff, or a gallonage increase.
Yeah.
And with more gallonage comes more trucks, potentially. More trucks need more manpower, not to mention the fact that you maybe need an extra person or two watching or monitoring the blanket, and I think you're going to talk about that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And that's like one thing too, and I know we're gonna get into it a little bit later, but like having that information, because also when you're talking, because I've briefed a few higher people now, because I've been recognized as the foam guy somehow, or falling into this kind
This
of
is
role.
going to help you then.
Right. But being able to, because that's been our biggest pushback for the manpower, right? We're like, oh, this stuff isn't as good. We need more people. But being able to kind of explain that to those people that aren't firefighters, those higher up officers, of being like, yes, this is not as good, but this is why we need the bodies, because now we have these positions and these, we need more agent that didn't exist before, because our old stuff was better. Because you just go into somebody and be like, this stuff sucks, I need more people, isn't gonna get you what you want.
No, there needs to be much more information there, and yeah, you just end up being the sheep that cried wolf.
Right.
It's like, well, let me explain why. For those of you who are willing to listen, let me explain why.
Right.
And that's a tough sell.
It-
It's a sell that takes time, and maybe it's something that requires disaster, unfortunately.
Right.
Requires bad things happening so that we can, hey, why did that bad thing happen? Like, what do you need? We need more of this. This is what we've been saying. Oh, okay, so this is why. I gotcha.
Yeah.
But some things are born out of tragedy. Unfortunately, that's kind of how humans work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that's what's happening now. We have lobbied in the Department of the Air Force for more manpower, and that's making its way through the wickets, and that takes a long time. There's a lot of procedural things there, but our leaders on high are advocating. I know that personally, so.
Right. I think so. The main thing too, also with F3, and like we obviously have highlighted this a few times, and I'll quit beating a dead horse. But main thing, right? You have to be intentional with what you're doing with your application, rather than AFFF. You could just kind of spray and pray. That's the main message out of that, is knowing the situations and knowing what to do about them and being intentional with that application.
Let's talk about the dangers then, and why you have to be intentional.
Okay.
Before we talk about employment. So, scientifically different, no surfactant. What does that do to the foam when I spray it onto the ground, spray it onto fuel?
Okay, so the biggest part, right, or one of the most concerning, and I talked about the seams, right, is the resealing properties. Without the film, they're not two. So if you're spraying out of two separate discharges, you're spraying two separate applications. Those two applications are not going to become homogeneous. They're not going to become one big blanket. They're going to be two separate blankets, and you're going to have that seam in between the two. So with that, you're going to have also, F3 is not oleophobic. I think that's how you say it. And so it doesn't repel oil. And so the hydrocarbons from the fuel will mix in with the fuel, and you're going to most likely always find that along your leading edge of your blanket.
Mix in with the foam. Fuel mixes in with foam, right?
Correct. And so with that and being able to see in real time, you're going to have along the seams, you're probably going to have some discoloration of where it picked up the fuel. And it's going to be like this grayish, brown, maybe even black. It's going to turn the white foam, it's going to discolor it. And so now, if you see that, you know that there's going to be fuel right there, which has the potential to burn. But that's also not only with the seams or the blankets not butting together and having that weak spot. That fuel is also another potential to burn. So you're going to have the vapors that are trying to find that weak spot, but also the fuel along the edge. It's your greatest probably potential to have. You'll have basically these little small linear fires across the seams between your blankets, and so then you got to lob over on top of that and be a nice gentle application to rain down over that to extinguish it. So that's the structure or the resealing danger of F3.
What about a little earlier you referenced something called tunneling? What's that?
So back to the film, right? And the film being able to suppress the vapors better. Without the film, the vapor pressures of the fuel can build up under the blanket. And so the flammable vapors or the superheated vapors, they want to find their way out. They want to find their way out from under the blanket. And so you can have these pressure buildups, and it'll almost look like bubbling under the foam blanket. And then once it gets to, it'll kind of move around or tunnel around trying to find a weak spot. And it can, even if you let it sit long enough, heat that foam up enough to where it starts to burst those bubbles, and then it'll kind of make its own weak spot. And so that's kind of where you get that, like, I was fighting the fire here, and now I have a fire over to my right, because maybe there was a pressure buildup, it moved over there, it was able to make the blanket weak enough, and now it can come through, the vapors can come through and reignite. It's probably the most dangerous thing that this foam can do, is it has the vapors have the ability to travel underneath the blanket and pop up somewhere you don't know where it's going to. Well, you could see it if you see it, right? But it has the potential, if you're engaged, right, and you're not necessarily focusing on the overall blanket, it has the potential to flank you at somewhere else.
So regardless if you notice a seam or you're noticing tunneling, it sounds like the solution is the same, in that
Correct.
more foam. We need to.
Yes, correct. And so, like, without the film, you need a thicker blanket to be able to suppress those vapors down. But like you just said, most of the hostile events, you can't spray the blanket directly, because then you're just blowing your blanket all over the place and it's not going to come back together. So you have to have that gentle lob over the top to build the blanket up without disrupting the main blanket you've already laid down. That makes sense.
And what kind of stream do you think is most effective to?
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I completely forgot, and that is like that's probably one of the most important parts, right? So we'll go into the actual like TTPs, but if you're not doing a roll-on or a bank down, I guess you should say, you should be at what's known as a 20-degree fog pattern or a hand width fog pattern. And it's kind of something that we did a poor job of explaining. Like, when you say hand width fog pattern, what does that even mean, right? So essentially, you're gonna have your nozzle, and you're gonna put your hand next to it, and you're gonna open the bail until the stream gets wide enough that it touches the tip of your fingers, and so you'll have like a nice penetrating fog pattern. So it's not too wide and it's not straight, but it's like right, I guess that's what they would call it, a power cone or whatever, but if you twist the bail until it touches your fingers, that's about that 20-degree pattern, and that's what they found, kind of aspirates the foam the best without maximizing or losing that reach.
There's, I imagine, some technique involved when it comes to the bail too, right? Depending on how far you are from the tunneling you're seeing occur, or from the seam where
Right.
bail all the way open. Obviously, you're going to send your
I never
stream
really
way
thought
farther.
about that. Yeah, like if you're in the blanket and it's right next to you, and not being too strong to like you're just blasting. Because also like they teach the rain down, and like there's nothing wrong with it. And if you need the reach of that, I guess you could also use a straight stream for rain down for maximum reach, but that's because you have the stream completely up and you're letting it fall back down. But I guess I've just never thought about, if you're close, you don't want to blast anything over, so maybe you could get away with, half bailing it. But its main takeaway is it needs to be gentle and over the top. Oh, that's what. So, like the rain down, if you have it straight up, because I guess you could, if it was close to you, just go straight up in the air and let it fall down. That was one of the things that like they show you in Dallas as well, is like the rain down, because the way that the F3 it just doesn't get thrown as good as AFFF. I feel like the reach with F3, from what I've seen, is not as good. But shooting the foam or doing like a actual rain down and shooting it up in the air, the wind can kind of just do whatever it wants to do with it. And so when I've seen people kind of bring the angle down a little bit and kind of switch to that 20-degree fog pattern, you get the more gentle rain down or rollover on the top of the blanket, rather than you kind of have, it seems like you have a little more control, or you get a little bit better knockdown of what you're trying to achieve. And the video that Matt's probably going to put up, you'll see it, though. They start high, and then the stream's kind of just doing whatever, and like the rain down is kind of going all over the blanket, the total blanket, because it's like, raining down, it's like mystifying in the air. But then they kind of bring it down a little bit better to be more of a, I guess, advantageous angle, and they're able to cover the seam a lot better and get the result that they want. So that's why I call it a lob.
And so that looks totally different than the initial application, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think the best plan A is for? We've got a fuel fire, we got a F-35 on fire, and we're just now applying agent.
So we didn't go over it in the decision making, but that's where like the OODA loop kind of comes into. So the OODA loop, for people who don't know, is observe, orient, decide, and act. And I think to me, it's still kind of recognition, prime decision making. You're observing conditions, you're orientating yourself, and then you're deciding and acting based upon those conditions that you observed. Why I like to use the OODA loop is I kind of think it's a little more firefighter friendly, of not really getting super, if you're not like a hardcore decision making nerd. But the biggest thing with F3 as well is orientating yourself of where you are in space. And what I mean by that is like, where did the crash occur? And so is it on the hard pavement or a surface that I'm able to do a roll on? Because so basically the progression is going to be roll on, horizontal or base sweep, and then rain down. You're going to try to make the blanket as robust as possible at first, and you're going to get that, just a couple good sweeps to build that blanket. You're going to transition to your horizontal with your 20-degree fog pattern. That's another reason the 20-degree fog pattern is kind of best practice as well, is the bottom half of the stream is still kind of rolling on what you built up, and the top half of the stream is kind of coming over the top now. And so you're able to you're basically building up a blanket and then using the horizontal to kind of continue to push that same blanket across. And then with the rain down or the lob being kind of your patch jobs. But the biggest thing with that, right, is crashes don't always happen perfect. So in both my instances, plan A was taken away. So I had to immediately go to, I didn't really know I was kind of doing it at the time, but I had to immediately go to the horizontal, right? Because I wasn't able to do a roll on. Same thing with the 16 crash or fire that those guys had. It was on an angle, kind of like in a ditch, so when they would try to do a roll on or whatever, it would just slide down the hill. So situation might not allow you to do that. So now you kind of pivot to plan B, back to the horizontal. It's going to work, right? Fire is eventually going to go out, but if you're on that hard packed surface and you have that fuel fire, try to build that blanket up as best as possible if you can. So that should be kind of the progression that you should try to achieve based upon your situation.
So I want to dive into those different methods. I think everybody understands what roll on and bank down are. Horizontal is a little bit harder to understand when people explain it. And listeners, go to firedog.us, go to this episode. There's going to be a video there of horizontal application. But before we roll into that, and you've talked a lot about the details already, I also want to mention a few more dangers, or two more dangers, of F3, which Austin brought up, I think, earlier, but is heat resistance, right? Because it doesn't have that surfactant anymore.
Right.
And so there's more direct flame impingement on those foam bubbles. So more heat impingement and more mixing. There's going to be mixing of the foam and the fuel. And then weather is a bigger consideration, right?
100%. And so, and that's funny. I didn't talk about the two things that I got to see for the most part in real life. But the heat resistance, right? So like Matt said, without the film, the bubbles are going to experience more direct flame impingement, or direct heat, and that causes those bubbles to burst. And then, kind of, we talked about it earlier, it's the foam will flatten out, and you'll have these like basically low spots if you're experiencing that, where it kind of will turn into, the naval study refers to it as milky foam, and that's kind of what it looks. It basically looks like Dawn dish soap, or if you're spraying something. Well, I'll go over it in a second, but anyway. It looks like Dawn dish soap, and that's for your fuel fires. But what we kind of also don't talk about is the fact that the pavement itself could be superheated, and this is the main thing that we kind of experienced on our incidents. But aircraft composite fires burn extremely hot, right? Like when I was looking through the tick at both the incidents, it was 1100 plus degrees. And so that foam, when you're spraying it directly or you're doing a horizontal onto the fuselage, it's going to get beat up for a while. And so that was the main thing that we were seeing, is when we were fighting, the aircraft fires, that at that temperature, the foam's going to get beat up for a while until you're able to cool that thing that you're, the surface that you're trying to put out. And then that's where it's going to burst your bubbles, and that's where you're going to get that like waxy foam, milky looking foam, and it's not going to be it's not going to be aerated at all because your bubbles bursted.
Which is another great reason, or another good explanation as to why we need more agent. Because you're going to expend more in trying to cool down before the foam is actually effective. So to the one commander that's listening to this episode, hopefully that helps you understand why we need more water, more manpower, and things of that sort. Let's talk about the equipment a little bit. Yeah. And I'm interested in how modulation works with this, and how do you employ, like, you talked about a little bit, what's plan A, B, and C. Where is modulation within that mix, and what can you do? How do you employ your turrets? Because we talked a lot about, in the videos that people are going to see, are going to be spraying a hose line. So first, talk to me about equipment, and specifically the nozzle that you mentioned in your presentation.
Okay, so and I'm not like sponsored by Elkhart Brass or anything, or neither is Dallas Fort Worth.
Not yet.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have tried actually to kind plugged in because they have so many people come through, and they've had vendors and stuff, whatever. It's not so much the brand. You can use whatever brand that you want, but they just found that 95 GPMs at 100 psi seem to work best with reach and aeration and all that with F3 just out of the nozzle. And so I kind of agree with this. They basically suggest three things. They suggest a 95 GPM fog nozzle at 100 psi, and then they suggest carrying a foam tube, which is basically an attachment that you can attach to the nozzle that helps kind of aerate and expand that foam, but you're going to lose reach with it. That's another, main thing with that, right? You're going to get a better blanket, but you're losing reach, so it's situational. And then they have the hybrid nozzle, which is like the TFT Hydra Cup or something, which is basically those two things molded into one. So they say, yeah, the hybrid nozzle works really good, and I think the Navy study also talks about using a hybrid nozzle as well. But that's one of those things where you have to be correctly trained on it. You got some new guy that just came from tech school, and he makes the wrong turn or wrong click or whatever, and now it's not on the mode that you want. And so I'm not going to say it's gimmicky, but I like the simplistic side of things of like the foam tube's either on or off. It's one clip. So that's what Eielson went with. That's what we did, because it's either on or off. You either need it or you don't need it. And the foam tube itself, I see that as more of an aftermath, mop up, cleanup kind of thing. Or say I'm having trouble getting a knockdown and I need that more robust. To me, plan A is always going to have the most maximum amount of reach possible, and then maybe after I get it knocked down to a comfortable level, I'll switch to the foam tube to make sure I don't have any blanket breakdown after the fact.
And that was your Brass Tacks Hard Facts.
Yeah, there you go. Hey man, great series though.
Hey, let me ask you, I was at Senior Fire Officer Summit back in August, and there was an F3 presentation where the presenter mentioned that F3 was not effective with ultra-high pressure. And that seemed to surprise some people. You could kind of hear the rustling in the crowd. Do you know much on that?
They bring it up, they talk about it in Dallas. I do actually know about it, and I'm not going to say how I know about it, but I have sprayed F3 out of an ultra-high pressure line. And the blanket that it produces...
You just said how you know about it.
Well, okay, that's fine. I'm not going to say the situation that I know about it. But the blanket that it produces is pretty pathetic, honestly, and I've seen that in real time, and I don't know, I think it's due to the bubble or the water itself, and it just turns into like mist, basically, like the little fans with the squirters. That's what it looks like. And I'm talking about banking down, doesn't matter, it just kind of all turns into that like liquid soupy milky foam instead of being built up or aspirated a little bit, as well as reach. F3, for whatever reason, I don't necessarily have the scientific answer, but from seeing it in real life, the reach with that as well is not as good. In the reach out of just a normal hand line can also get beat up, especially in like wind and the cold. We saw that on the crash. It was like 0 degrees, I think, with like a wind chill of like -10 or something. Don't quote me on that. I do know it was 0 degrees. I don't remember what the wind chill was, but it was, kind of almost, it was so cold the foam was like crystallizing, and it was causing us to not have as much reach out of our hand lines.
Let's get into application methods. Talk to me about horizontal first, because this is the one that I think that you need to do or see a video of to understand.
Okay, so horizontal, yeah, like Matt said, I mean, most people know, hopefully know, because it's not, none of these have changed from AFFF. It's just more or less, when am I going to employ them, right? Of like knowing the what, how, and why of when to use these things situationally, or what I'm trying to accomplish, right? And so horizontal is, we did our roll on, and now we want to go horizontal, or whatever. Say roll on's not we're not able to do a roll on. We're kind of bringing it like chest height. We're changing to that 20-degree fog pattern, and essentially we're just sweeping the base of the fire, and we're trying to get that bottom half to kind of do a roll on, or continue pushing our blanket, and the top half to roll over the top.
How is it different than roll-on then? Or are they the same thing?
It's basically you're doing, they're not the same thing, because a roll-on you would want to engage the fire probably, I would say, 15-ish feet back. Because you don't want to be too steep with a roll-on. You don't want to be too steep at an angle, because now you're starting to plunge and you're blowing fuel everywhere. You want to be more out in front of you, so it's able to hit that and project forward, if that makes sense.
So is roll-on, you're closer, horizontal, you're further away?
I would say the opposite. Roll on, you're further away, and you're initiating your attack with that, and you're building that blanket up with a few sweeps. Now you can kind of bring that stream up to continue pushing what you had before. So like you can stay in the same position where you started until you've lost reach. So where I engage the fire, right, I start my roll on. I've got all I can push out, as far as I can push out in front of me. Now I bring that stream chest height, I'm going to have more reach or more distance, right? And so from that, I still want to try to push what I already built up, and continue pushing that with my newfound reach. And that's what the bottom half of the stream is doing. You're just continually to push the blanket that you built up. And then once I'm out of reach, so I'm not able to go any further, and hopefully at that point I'm going to have I am going to have some knockdown of the fire. I'll be safe to move up in a linear fashion, right? Try to keep it as like in the same application as much as you can, but you bought that space. You've made that safe space, or that space safe. Now I can advance and just basically continue to do what I need to do until I get full extinguishment.
You make a great point that if you move left or right, you're starting over again, right? Because the work that you've done is theoretically right in front of you, right?
You can move left or right. Everything needs to be in a line. And you're basically trying to continue to push that line as far up as you possibly can. Where you would start to see two separate applications is if you started, say you have a quadrant, right? You start in this bottom quadrant, and then you come over here and you have to spray again, or you are spraying from the side. Then you would probably start to see that's where those two blankets are going to be, kind of like that. So with F3, that's another thing. And you may have to do that. If you've got a big plane where you have quadrants, you may have 4 separate applications. But the thing, and we can talk about that with like modulation, right? Driving around in a circle, spraying an aircraft, and not being intentional where I'm trying to have my blanket is no longer a thing. Because now you're going to have 37 different applications that I don't really know where, so you have to be intentional of where you're starting your attack, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm trying to understand it, and I'm trying to make sure to ask the right questions so that listeners can understand it too, because again, it's different than AFFF. And when I went through and learned how to be an ARF driver operator in 2008 or whenever it was, modulation's the first thing. That is in my mental Rolodex.
Right.
How do I break free of that? So So I like to use scenarios, right? Hypothetical scenarios. A downed aircraft and trapped people. Let's say it's upright, and we're taught to protect the path of egress. So if I'm a crash truck, how do I approach that?
What type of aircraft?
F-35. Well, let's call it. It doesn't. I don't know. It doesn't matter. I don't.
So
think,
in my mind, right, fighters, you can almost always do what
modulation is less important if
Correct.
it's a smaller frame. Is what you're getting at?
What's gonna deter, like, and I kind of have this, right? That's like one of those decision making points of like type of aircraft, volume of fire, right? Like, yes, is there a lot of fire with a big fireball with a fighter? Absolutely, it's jet fuel. You're gonna have a big explosion. But like a heavy, right? Like that fuel volume is way more, right? So like that's kind of where I see the turrets being used. I'm not saying like if they pull up on a fighter and you spray your turret and get a knockdown on it, like that's wrong. But with like the handline, I could be way more intentional with my application and be able to kind of do. So that's where I would go with people trap. Fighter trap, I'm probably pulling a line and I'm cutting that path straight stream, pushing the foam wherever I need to, or pushing the fuel wherever I need to go, and then I'm kind of holding the line there, and then hopefully somebody behind me is able to get them out. You want Dallas Fort Worth or the FAA, their plan for a heavy or an airliner, if people are trapped, is basically try and shelter in place for them. They're trying to get the outside as under control as possible, because now you got to think, right? You got a large pool of fuel for the heavy. That person jumps into that and disrupts the foam blanket. There's potential that they're going to have reignition right there when you got a bunch of holes getting poked in your fuel blanket. So that's like, and that's the thing with F3, right? That's my mindset, because I want to go in there and get those people out. But it's also one of those things of like, I got to get the outside under control before I can go in and get the inside and get them out, because I haven't made the outside safe yet.
Yeah, there's a lot of points, and I'm kind of playing devil's advocate, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of it too. It's new for everybody,
right?
It's new for all of us, and so I think it's important we have these conversations. I'm not trying to call you out or the FFA out, but as you're talking about that, I'm thinking instincts don't care. Human instincts don't care. You're going to tell people to shelter in place when it's 2,000 degrees outside of the fuselage,
right?
Is that? And there's also something to be said about the mechanical forces of water and agent and moving fuel out of the way too, right? So that could be a consideration, a tactical consideration when we're talking about creating a rescue path. Maybe we're not necessarily cooling, or maybe we're cooling just a little bit, maybe we're not extinguishing, but maybe we can have an ability to push things out of the way. But to your point too, I mean, it takes a lot more water. We've already discussed this, and so there's an element of conservation that you have to think about too. Maybe I don't want to use my turret as much. And another point I wanted to bring up was the turrets exist for a reason. They're a first strike capability. The reason they exist is so that you could put agent at the soonest opportunity. I don't have to worry about opening the damn door, deploying a hose, all right, charge it up, right? The whole intent behind a turret is reach, but timeliness too.
Right.
So I guess I'm hesitant to tell anybody, and I'm not suggesting that you have told anybody, but I'm hesitant to say to anybody, go straight to a handline, because you can be more intentional about how you're applying and conservative.
And I think it's similar to a deck gun. It's the same thing of like, you pull up to a house and the whole front side of the house or porch is on fire, and I'm taking however long the guys to stretch the line.
That's a great example. Yeah.
And they did that on the 16 fire too. If it buys you time, buy yourself time.
What are you saying? They use a deck gun?
No, they used the turret on the.
No,
They
no, I
used
got you.
Yeah, they used the turret to knock it down, and then they mopped it up with the hand line. Just
got you.
understand that those two applications are now going to be separate, and deal with that accordingly. Because they knocked it down, and then the fuel tank ruptured, and then they had a running fuel fire basically. But based on the slope, they were having trouble because the foam and the fuel just kept sliding down.
Great conversations. Again, I'm not trying to stump the chump or anything. I'm just talking out loud. It's a different weapon system, as people refer to it as, but
Right.
It's different than AFFF, and that's the entire point. And so the tactics are going to change too.
Right.
We talked about modulation, the different application methods. Go
One
ahead.
thing with modulation too. Sorry. So best practice is going to be your bumper turret, just due to it's lower on the truck. It's not as steep of an angle, so you're not going to have that, you don't want to plunge into the fuel. So with that steeper or that more gentle angle, right, you can still use it to, do all the things you can do with your hand line, right? You can use the roll on, you can use the horizontal, you can use the bank down or the rain down. But they just found that lower angle on the truck doesn't cause as steep of an angle, and there's less plunging. You're able to kind of get that stream more out in front of you, like you would do with the hand line.
Okay.
Not that your roof turret can't be used. You can, if you need the reach, or you're trying to cool the fuselage, directly or whatever, use your roof turret. But if you're rolling up and you have your roof turret super high, you're going to spray stuff potentially where you don't want it to go.
Really, I think in my mind trying to find the differences between the two things, the legacy foam and now the new stuff, and how to employ it, I see us really going to handline much quicker than what we used to.
Mm-hmm.
I think is what it comes down to.
Right.
Whereas we would rely so heavily on a roof and a bumper turret. Now it's like, at the soonest opportunity, let's employ that handline.
Mm-hmm.
Or multiple handlines.
Right.
Not saying don't use the turrets, but be intentional about how you use them, how often you use them, and then how soon you get that line out. And once you get that line out, and depending on your circumstance and the conditions that you're faced with, because that's always a variable, right? Cut that roof turret, cut that bumper turret, and let's go straight to handline.
Right.
I think you really, in the future of this, you just have to be more intentional about how you're employing your tactics.
Because you also got to think too of, like, there's a few videos of like the roof turret going, or the bumper turret, truck pulls up, bumper turret's going, and now the hand line on the side is going, and now they're both spraying on a linear plane, and the bumper turret's basically blowing. You're basically going to
be fighting against each other.
Right, exactly. You're going to be blowing two blankets two separate ways.
You just waste an agent.
1,000%. So with that, right, and we already brought up that it takes more agent to put this stuff out. You have to be intentional with so if you go bumper turret, stick to bumper turret for as long as possible until you just either need the handline to mop it up or you lost the reach, right? Based upon whatever situation you're dealt with. But try to make that, that's why I think, to advocate to your point of the handline, you have to basically stick your foot in the ground, and whatever decision you go with, you kind of have to roll with it until you're, faced with having to pivot after whatever, the initial knockdown.
Real quick, talk to me about the importance of onlookers, monitoring backup positions.
Yeah, so this is a kind of a new thing, right, of like these positions, and kind of going back to the manpower thing of like we want more people, or we've justified more people, but it's a kind of being able to explain why we need these positions, right? So now with every line, you should basically have 3 people stacked to the line, because if you drag your hose through a blanket, it's going to cause a seam. It's gonna disrupt the foam blanket, and it's not going to reseal behind you. So essentially that third guy is just on the handline to hold the hose up behind you and to keep it out of the blanket as, the crew chief and the nozzleman advance into the blanket. That what that third guy can do, which really everyone should be doing, unless you're, maybe the nozzleman and you're directly engaging or fighting fire, is that third guy and the backup, or the first backup guy, need to be kind of monitoring the conditions of the blanket to make sure they're not having, any of that ghosting or tunneling or having any of that degradation of the blanket where they could potentially get flanked. Because that was one of the things in the Navy study, not knocking them, right? But like a lot of the studies advocate that the horizontal is the go-to method, but that's because you're spraying the fire directly, right? And so they have a pretty decent fuel fire they're fighting, and they're doing a horizontal, and then they advance into the blanket, and then directly to their left they get flanked because they get some reflash because that foam blanket broke down. So it's like, if you don't have a life safety, why not try to make the foam blanket as robust as possible first? Kind of the quality over quantity thing, or quality versus speed. Am I putting it out faster just to come back and redo it again? So that was one of the considerations of that too.
One thing I'd love to see from certainly NCOs, crew chiefs, training chiefs, is I feel like there's such a need to lean into the language we use, standardizing this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's, like tunneling's a perfect example for that to be the term we use as an AFSC, that the airman on the line's brain triggers to, okay, tunneling, rain down in whatever area, right? Like their brain, back to the recognition prime decision making, jumps to the solution based off of this one term we're using for whether it's horizontal application, whether it's seam, to lean into.
Yeah, there is some jargon that needs to be created, and that was kind of like what you were talking about, Matt. Is like Chief Hughes. He was like, you need to, more referring to the backup line or the secondary attack line, which is not really a backup line or a secondary attack line, but it's more of a blanket management group, basically. And it's not necessarily RIT. It could be RIT. It's probably going to be RIT right now because we don't have the manpower, and we have to kind of find a loophole until we get the ability to have this extra line that we need with the 3 extra bodies on top of it. But they're pretty much sitting there with a tick and just basically covering those guys back in case they do get flanked and they don't see it, or they are starting to get that tunneling and ghosting, or they have a seam that they couldn't see. That backup team can start to do that gentle application over the top to kind of cover those guys and make sure they don't get put in a bad spot. And so, like you said, we don't have a name for that right now. I don't know what to call it because, I'm not the foam guy making all the decisions.
You're the foam guy, man. You already told us you're the foam guy.
No. But, I am the foam guy now, apparently. It's been somewhat of an obsession. It's a side quest. That's what I'll call it.
You know what's so funny to me, because I know you personally, the fact that you're like, I don't want to call you hyper invested, but you're the foam guy when you're like a structural guy at heart.
Yeah, for sure.
Isn't that hilarious?
That's it's kind of like the irony of the situation of like
how did I ended up here, man?
I did, but I think it's just because the way that I think about structural. I applied I've done all of this, the same methodology, same thinking, and applied that to structural, and that's why I think I've been mildly successful with this. Is I just applied that to this F3. That's all I did, and so it's like, with like the RPD and the OODA loop and all that, it can be applied to every single aspect of our job. You just have to have all the nuts and bolts. You have to have true understanding of the situation and be able to distill the information down that people that don't have a frame of reference it's usable for them.
That's a good point for instructors anywhere, for any top subject.
Right.
I think our egos tell us that we want to feel and sound smart about things, and you really have to subordinate that. And if you're really trying to convey a point, I always like to say, break out the crayons, man. I need the crayons broken out for me.
Right.
And that's why I was like, talk to me about horizontal and roll on, dude. Like, what are we talking about here?
Right.
What's a secondary versus a backup versus RIT,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
No, for sure.
Important points.
No, it's for sure, because and it's also important to have somebody to be able to kind of pull those threads for you, right? Because sometimes we don't realize that, like, you're operating at like 30,000 feet and they're surface level, and they have no clue what you're talking about. Because I start talking heat flux and stuff to people, and they're like, huh? And it's just really confusing. But now, you got to be able to, like, okay, break that apart to where it's absorbable to them. Anyway, that's instruction. But back to jargon, right? So yeah, the secondary hand line, or really would be a third hand line, is more of like a blanket management group. You got your guy with a tick, kind of scanning the blanket and seeing if he can kind of see any vapors coming up that maybe the guys can't necessarily see, looking for those hostile events or those safety concerns, and then being able to kind of gently apply more foam if need be.
We covered a lot, Austin.
Yeah, that was...
Man, there's a lot in your brain, but I appreciate all the work that you put into this, just to help us understand it, man. And there's a lot more, I think, that needs to be figured out. And I think there's an opportunity to standardize some things to the best of our ability.
100%.
ARF playbooks and stuff like that too,
Yeah, and this is like you said, this is an ongoing. What I said right now, in 2 years could probably completely change. Right,
Sure.
This is just our best information at the time.
Yeah, it's a new thing.
And it's a brand new thing. Like, as the next crash happens, they might find something that worked better, right? So it's an evolving process, and like, as the enterprise as a whole, we're figuring this out. So I think that it's okay to not know. We're trying to do the best thing that we can do right now.
Yeah, you're certainly pulling your fair share. I appreciate everything. I appreciate you coming on today, sharing everything. Again, listeners, go to firedog.us, find this episode, and I'm going to dump as much as I can find in there in videos. And the China Lake study is what you've been referring to throughout the episode, right?
Yeah, I believe so. That's where the Naval Research Lab is.
Yeah, in California. That's a great read if this kind of stuff interests you, which it should if you're responsible for our firefighting.
Those might be separate. There's a Naval Research Laboratory study directly on F-3.
Yeah, it was done at China Lake.
Okay.
So that's when I say China Lake, that's what I mean too. So.
Gotcha.
You got anything else before we wrap it up? Chris, you got anything else?
I do. Okay, one last thing. Reapplication is almost certain. So don't feel bad if you don't knock it or get a complete knockdown off the rip. Like, you're going to have to reapply this stuff in some form or fashion. Whether that's just covering the seams, covering the flat spots, whatever it may be, or maybe you get some degradation and it pokes through again. It's going to happen. So that's kind of one of the other reasons of needing more agent. It's gonna take a little bit. So if you have to do that, don't feel like you did something wrong or you weren't doing it right. It's just the way that this stuff is.
Yeah, don't compromise quality for speed.
Right.
Because you're going to end up having to redo something.
Right.
Unless we're trying to maybe use water as a mechanical force to make room for people to walk away. But other than that.
Right. That's the last thing I got.
Cool. Well, appreciate your time, man.
No problem, man.
Have a good one. It's good to have you back on.
Yeah, later.
Bye.
Peace.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fire Dog Podcast. You can find more episodes like this on our website, firedog.us, or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're also on YouTube, and we're on social media. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at the Fire Dog Podcast. That is the Fire, D-A-W-G Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, so you can stay plugged into every new episode. We'd appreciate it if you'd share this podcast with your friends and your coworkers, whether on social media or within your firehouse. This is Matt Wilson with co-host Chris Boikley and guest Austin Perry. Until next time, stay safe.